The first round landed short, a dull thud that rattled the metal walls of the forward operating base and sent dust drifting from the ceiling. Sirens screamed over shouted orders as smoke rolled across the supply route, thick and oily, stinging the eyes. In the middle of it all, an armored vehicle sat dead across the road, tracks locked, engine coughing uselessly as alarms wailed from inside its hull. Officers clustered nearby, voices sharp and overlapping. Someone swore. Someone else pointed at the vehicle and demanded it be pushed aside or abandoned. When a quiet man in grease-stained gloves stepped forward, one of them scoffed and waved him back. They needed a real crew, not a mechanic. Another laugh followed, thin and nervous, the kind that came when fear needed somewhere to go. The man did not argue. He did not raise his voice or defend himself. He looked once at the smoking engine, then back at the officers, calm in a way that felt almost out of place. "I'm just a mechanic," he said evenly, as if stating a fact no one else cared to hear. Another shell landed closer this time. The ground jumped. Shouts turned urgent. Seconds mattered now, and the road was still blocked. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? Sergeant First Class Daniel Mercer did not look like the men most people expected to see near the front edge of a fight. He was in his early 40s, shoulders slightly rounded from years bent over engines, hands darkened by oil that never quite washed out of the skin. His gloves were stained and worn thin at the fingertips, and he wore them the way others wore weapons, with familiarity rather than pride. He stood a little apart from the cluster of younger soldiers, posture relaxed but deliberate, weight balanced evenly on both boots. There was no visible swagger in him, no restless energy or sharp movements. While others scanned the sky or the road, Daniel's eyes kept drifting back to the disabled vehicle, studying it the way a doctor studied a patient. Most of the younger troops barely noticed him at first. To them, he looked like someone who belonged behind the wire, in a motor pool or maintenance bay, far from incoming fire. A rear echelon mechanic, useful but not essential, someone who fixed problems after the danger had passed. One private leaned toward another and muttered that the old sergeant had probably gotten lost on his way to the workshop. The comment earned a quiet chuckle, quickly swallowed by the noise of the base. Daniel did not react. He adjusted the strap of his helmet and kept watching the vehicle. A junior officer, barely past his first deployment, glanced at Daniel with open confusion. He asked why maintenance personnel were even this close to the supply route during an engagement. The question was not cruel, just dismissive, as if Daniel's presence were a clerical error rather than a deliberate choice. Daniel answered politely, giving his rank and assignment without elaboration. His voice was steady and unremarkable, carrying no edge or challenge. When the officer turned away, apparently unsatisfied but already distracted, Daniel did not follow him with his eyes. Instead, he knelt beside a crate and began checking his tools. He laid them out in a neat line, each piece placed the same way he always placed it, handle facing the same direction. A wrench that looked fine at a glance was tested again, tightened, loosened, then set aside. He had always worked this way. Twice for every bolt. Once with the hands, once with the ear. Daniel leaned toward the disabled vehicle and listened, head tilted slightly, as if the engine might whisper something useful if he paid close enough attention. Even with alarms blaring and distant impacts echoing off the hills, he seemed to separate the noise in layers, isolating what mattered from what did not. Someone nearby asked if he was nervous. Daniel took a slow breath through his nose, held it for a moment, then let it out evenly. His chest barely moved. If he felt fear, it did not show on his face or in his hands. This calm was not new. It had been shaped over years and places most of the men around him had only heard about in passing. The audience would not hear the details yet, but the weight of those experiences lived in the way Daniel carried himself. There were hints, if anyone had been looking closely enough. The faded deployment patch on his sleeve, worn soft by time rather than neglect. The way he instinctively positioned himself with solid cover at his back. The way his eyes checked arcs and angles without conscious thought. When a loud impact shook the ground again, a few soldiers flinched hard, shoulders jumping. Daniel's reaction was smaller, almost invisible, just a tightening of his jaw and a shift of his stance. He waited for the echoes to fade before moving again. To most of them, he was still just a mechanic, a man whose value lay in tools and spare parts, not in the moment when things went wrong. His reputation followed him like a quiet shadow, reliable, dependable, never flashy, never the one whose name got passed around in stories. That reputation suited him fine. Daniel had learned long ago that attention was rarely helpful in the middle of a job. Machines did not care who fixed them. They only cared that the hands working on them were steady. He ran a thumb along the edge of a panel, feeling for heat, for vibration, for signs others missed. His movements were economical, practiced, free of wasted motion. Even under pressure, he did not rush. A younger sergeant watched him for a moment, then looked away, unsure what to make of him. There was something unsettling about how unbothered Daniel seemed, as if the chaos around them existed at a distance he could control. Daniel had seen machines fail in calm places and in violent ones. He had seen people freeze when alarms went off, and he had seen them rise to the moment. Over time, a simple belief had taken root in him, quiet and unshakable. Machines fail. People panic. Discipline holds. It was not something he said out loud. It was something he practiced every day, whether anyone noticed or not. As the base buzzed with tension and arguments flared again near the blocked route, Daniel finished his checks and stood. He wiped his hands on a rag, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his pocket. He looked once more at the disabled armored vehicle, eyes narrowing just slightly, not with frustration but with focus. Whatever others thought of him, whatever names they used or doubts they carried, the problem in front of him was real. And problems like that had always been his responsibility, whether anyone acknowledged it or not. Without waiting for permission, he took a step toward the vehicle. The disabled tank did not just block the supply route, it dominated it. Smoke bled steadily from its rear grille, drifting low across the road and curling around boots and tires, turning the narrow stretch of ground into a bottleneck that everyone had to acknowledge. Every vehicle behind it slowed. Every radio transmission circled back to the same problem. Command's patience thinned by the minute. Over the radio, clipped voices argued about timelines and alternatives, about rerouting convoys and pulling back before the next barrage walked any closer. Someone finally said what many were already thinking. Leave it, mark it. Destroy it if necessary. Inside the tank, the crew waited in rigid silence, helmets still on, hands clenched around straps and rails. They had done everything they were trained to do, and it had not been enough. The engine was dead. The systems were failing. They were sitting targets. One of them climbed out briefly to report damage, his movements quick and tight, eyes flicking toward the hills with every step. He spoke fast, voice strained, explaining what had failed and what they had already tried. No one interrupted him, but no one looked hopeful either. Nearby, an officer kicked at a piece of loose gravel and swore under his breath. He said they did not have time for field repairs, not here, not now. Another nodded and added that maintenance could handle it later, somewhere safer. The words later and safer hung in the air like accusations. Daniel stood just within earshot. He heard every word, every sharp edge of dismissal. He did not move closer yet. He watched the crew, the vehicle, the ground beneath it, as if mapping the problem from the outside in. Someone noticed him again and scoffed openly this time. The remark was tossed out without malice, but with a careless certainty that cut just as deep. If they let a mechanic crawl around under fire, they would all end up dead. A few soldiers laughed, quick and brittle, the sound of nerves more than humor. Daniel did not answer. He did not look at the speaker. He stayed exactly where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, eyes still on the tank. The laughter faded faster than it had started. It did not feel as funny once it lingered in the open air. Another impact thudded somewhere beyond the wire, closer than before, close enough to make the ground shiver. A different voice cut in, sharper now, demanding a decision. Either move the vehicle or abandon it. There was no third option offered. Time pressed in from all sides. Daniel took one step forward, then another, slow and deliberate, until he stood beside the tank's scarred hull. He rested a gloved hand against the metal, feeling the vibration, the heat, the life that was still there beneath the damage. An officer noticed and snapped at him to back away. The tone was not cruel, but it was firm, the kind of voice used to reassert control when things felt like they were slipping. Daniel stopped where he was. He did not argue. He did not explain. His silence began to stand out. In a place filled with shouting and radio noise, with orders and counter-orders flying back and forth, the absence of his voice created a small pocket of stillness. People started to notice it, even if they did not understand why. Another soldier muttered that this was a waste of time. Someone else said the tank crew should already be out and moving. Each comment landed heavier than the last, not louder, but more pointed, sharpening the tension rather than releasing it. Daniel remained quiet. He checked his watch once, then looked toward the horizon, calculating distances most people around him were not thinking about. When the next round landed, he adjusted his stance without looking down. Radio chatter tightened. Call signs overlapped. A request for air support was denied, then reconsidered, then put on hold. Every transmission carried urgency, stripped of anything unnecessary. The crew inside the tank grew more restless. One of them leaned out again, eyes wide behind his visor, asking if there was any update. The answer was a half-formed sentence that went nowhere. What would you have done in that moment? Would you have trusted experience or rank? Daniel shifted closer again, this time ignored. The arguments had grown too loud, too focused inward, to register his movement. He crouched beside the track assembly and ran his fingers along the damaged section, eyes narrowing slightly. A junior NCO watched him with open doubt, then with irritation. He asked, not unkindly but firmly, what Daniel thought he was doing. Daniel glanced up, met his eyes for a brief second, and then looked back to the metal in front of him. Still no answer. That silence began to work on people. It removed the satisfaction of confrontation. There was nothing to push against, no defensive posture to exploit. It forced attention back onto the problem itself. Another shell landed. Dust rained down. The base shook, not violently, but enough to remind everyone how exposed they were. The laughter was gone now. The impatience that replaced it felt sharper, more dangerous. Someone said they were running out of time. Someone else said they already had. Daniel finished his inspection and stood, brushing dirt from his knee. He took a step back and scanned the vehicle as a whole, not just the damage, his gaze moving methodically from front to rear. He nodded once to no one in particular. An officer noticed the gesture and snapped at him again, asking if he had something to say. Several heads turned. For a moment, it seemed like Daniel might finally speak. He did not. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded rag, and wiped his hands slowly, carefully, as if the world around him were not closing in. The deliberate calm of the motion drew eyes despite themselves. A soldier near the back muttered that this was insane. Another said they should pull the crew now, before it was too late. The words "too late" echoed heavy with implication. Enemy fire increased, not dramatically, but steadily. The rhythm changed. Rounds landed with less space between them, closer to the route, closer to the blocked vehicle. Each impact tightened shoulders, shortened breaths. Daniel listened to the pattern, head tilting slightly, as if counting beats in a piece of music only he could hear. He adjusted his helmet strap, checked his gloves again, and stepped forward once more. This time, an officer moved to block him. The man's face showed strain, not arrogance. He was responsible for lives, and the risk in front of him felt unnecessary. He told Daniel they were pulling back, that the call had been made. Daniel stopped, inches away. He looked at the officer's face, then past him to the tank, to the crew waiting inside. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes sharpened, focused. The officer hesitated. It was brief, barely perceptible, but it was there. He had expected protest or compliance, not this quiet certainty. Around them, the crowd had gone still, not silent, but attentive in a way it had not been before. Conversations trailed off. Radios were lowered slightly, though the chatter continued. Daniel took another slow breath. He remained wordless, but his presence now felt heavier, more deliberate, as if he were anchoring himself against the chaos rather than being swept up in it. The officer glanced back toward command, then at the road, then at Daniel again. The decision weighed visibly on him. Doubt flickered, not about Daniel's competence, but about the certainty of abandoning the vehicle. The knot tightened further. Nobody laughed now. Nobody joked. The unease that settled over the group was different from fear. It was the discomfort of realizing that something important was being overlooked, and that the cost of ignoring it might be higher than anyone wanted to admit. Daniel waited. Daniel moved toward the damaged tank as if the incoming fire belonged to another place entirely. Each impact drew flinches from the soldiers nearby, but his steps stayed measured, his posture unchanged. He crouched low beside the hull, one hand braced against the metal, the other tracing the line of damage with practiced care. The engine was still hot. He felt it through the glove and nodded faintly, as though confirming something he had already suspected. He leaned in closer, listening, head tilted, separating the grind of stressed metal from the deeper rhythm beneath it. Even with alarms and radio chatter bleeding into the air, his focus never wavered. He spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, using terms that made a few heads turn. He mentioned torque tolerances and stress fractures, referenced alignment drift and feedback loops in the fire control system. It was not the vocabulary of a motor pool mechanic working off a checklist. It was the language of someone who understood how machines behaved when lives depended on them. A nearby specialist frowned, listening more closely now. He had spent enough time around vehicles to recognize when someone knew what they were talking about, and Daniel's words carried a confidence that could not be faked. Not loud, not assertive. Just precise. As Daniel shifted his weight, his sleeve rode up his forearm for a moment. A pale, jagged scar cut across skin darkened by sun and years of work. It was old, healed long ago, but deep enough to tell a story. No one asked about it. Daniel did not seem aware that it had been seen. He reached up and placed both hands against the turret housing, pressing gently, then more firmly, as if feeling for balance rather than force. With a subtle adjustment, he realigned the turret by feel alone, compensating for damage that had thrown it off center. The movement was instinctive, done without hesitation or instruction. Inside the tank, one of the crew members felt the shift and froze. He leaned closer to the internal controls, checking readings, then glanced toward the open hatch. His eyes lingered on Daniel longer this time. Daniel murmured something under his breath as he worked, a short phrase that meant nothing to most of the people standing nearby, but the crewman stiffened when he heard it. It was an old call sign, one that had not been used in years, spoken the way veterans spoke to themselves when habit took over. The crewman said nothing. He just watched. Daniel tapped the side of the hull twice, then paused, listening again. Another round landed in the distance, closer than before, but he did not look up. He adjusted a panel, tightened a fastener by feel, then checked it again, just to be sure. A senior crewman climbed halfway out of the hatch now, movements cautious but curious. He studied Daniel's hands, the way they moved without wasted motion, the way he seemed to anticipate problems before they showed themselves. Something in his expression shifted, doubt giving way to recognition, though he could not yet name what he was seeing. Daniel glanced up briefly, meeting the crewman's eyes. There was no bravado in the look, no reassurance either, just a calm acknowledgement, as if to say he understood the risk and accepted it. The crewman nodded once, slowly, and stayed quiet. Around them, the atmosphere changed. The earlier dismissal did not return, but neither did open respect. Instead, there was a growing sense of uncertainty, a feeling that the assumptions everyone had made might be incomplete. Someone whispered a question to another soldier, asking who Daniel really was. The answer came back as a shrug. Just a mechanic. That was all anyone knew for sure. Daniel finished one adjustment and moved to another, working methodically despite the pressure closing in. His breathing stayed even. His hands did not shake. The calm he carried was not showy or dramatic. It was the kind that came from repetition, from having faced similar moments before and survived them. He wiped his hands on his rag, folded it again, and tucked it away. He checked the alignment one last time, then stepped back, scanning the vehicle from a distance now, as if seeing it as a whole rather than a collection of damaged parts. The senior crewman leaned back inside the tank, speaking quietly to the others. Their posture shifted, tension easing just a fraction, not because the danger was gone, but because someone outside seemed to understand it better than they did. Daniel stood there, silent once more, waiting. Curiosity had replaced laughter now. Doubt had not vanished, but it had softened, reshaped into questions no one yet dared to ask. Whatever Daniel Mercer had been before this moment, whatever experiences lay behind the scars and the steady hands, it was clear he was more than he appeared. Still, no one said it out loud. Daniel did not step back when the order to abandon the vehicle came down again. He stood where he was, eyes on the ground beneath the tank, then lifted his gaze to the road ahead. His voice, when he finally used it, was calm and low, carrying just far enough to be heard by the officer nearest him. If they pulled the tank now, he said, it would slide sideways on the uneven ground. The slope was wrong. The timing was worse. It would block the route completely, not just slow it. His words were not defiant. They were factual, offered the way one offered a warning about weather rather than an opinion. The officer stared at him, surprised more by the certainty than the content. He asked how Daniel could be so sure. Daniel pointed with 2 fingers, tracing the line of the road and the way it dipped toward the ditch. He mentioned traction loss, center of gravity, the way damaged track teeth behaved under load. He did not raise his voice. He did not repeat himself. The argument stalled, not because Daniel had won it, but because no one immediately knew how to counter it. Daniel turned toward the tank and spoke again, this time to the crew. He told them to power down completely. He told them to wait for his signal before touching anything. His tone was steady, almost conversational, but it carried authority that did not need to announce itself. Inside the hull, hands moved without hesitation. Switches were thrown. The engine noise faded to a tense silence broken only by distant impacts and the hiss of smoke. Daniel crouched low, scanning the ground, then shook his head slightly. That would not work. He moved instead to the opposite side of the vehicle, stepping into open space with no cover beyond the tank itself. A few soldiers noticed and stiffened, watching him go. Someone shouted a warning about incoming fire. Daniel raised one hand briefly, not dismissing the danger, just acknowledging it. He kept moving. He climbed onto the hull, boots finding purchase on scorched metal with practiced ease. From there, he leaned down into the exposed components, bracing himself with one arm while the other worked. His movements were careful but decisive, the kind that came from knowing exactly how much force was enough and how much would break something permanently. Rounds impacted nearby, sending fragments of dirt and stone skittering across the metal. One struck close enough to ring against the hull, sharp and loud. Daniel did not flinch. He adjusted his footing and continued. He called out instructions, short and precise. Rotate the turret 1 degree left. Hold there. Lock it. Wait. The crew responded instantly, voices tight but controlled. There was no questioning now, no hesitation. Whatever doubts they had carried earlier had been replaced by trust born of necessity. Daniel reached deeper into the mechanism, fingers working where visibility was poor. He adjusted a component that had been knocked just far enough out of place to cause cascading failures. It was the kind of repair that manuals warned against doing in the field, the kind that assumed time, safety, and ideal conditions. None of those existed here. Another impact landed, closer still. The ground shook. Someone yelled again, louder this time, telling Daniel to get down. He did not answer. He finished the adjustment, checked it once more by feel, then signaled for power. The engine coughed, sputtered, then died. A groan rippled through the onlookers, heavy with disappointment and fear. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, listening, counting silently, then leaned back in. He made a second adjustment, smaller than the first, compensating for damage that could not be fully undone. Sweat ran down his temple, cutting a clean line through the grime on his face. He wiped it away with the back of his glove and nodded. Power again. This time, the engine caught. Not smoothly, not cleanly, but it came alive, a rough, uneven growl that vibrated through the hull and into the ground beneath them. A few soldiers let out involuntary breaths they had not realized they were holding. Daniel did not celebrate. He raised a hand, signaling restraint. Not yet. He slid down from the hull and moved to the rear, positioning himself directly behind the tank, fully exposed to the open ground beyond. Several people shouted at once, alarmed by where he had placed himself. He ignored them. He knelt, watching the tracks as they began to move, eyes sharp, body tense. He called out minor adjustments, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise. Slower, steady. Hold that line. The tank lurched forward a short distance, then shuddered. The engine faltered but did not die. Daniel leaned closer, one hand raised, the other gripping the edge of the hull. Enemy fire continued, not dramatically, but persistently. The danger was real, constant, unrelenting. Dust kicked up around Daniel as rounds struck nearby. He stayed where he was, exposed, because this was the only place he could see what he needed to see. The crew followed his instructions without question now. They trusted his timing more than their own instincts. When he told them to stop, they stopped. When he told them to push, they pushed. The tank moved again, this time farther. The route began to clear, inch by inch. It was not fast, it was not clean. But it was working. Daniel shifted position slightly, tracking the movement, adjusting his signals. His focus was absolute. The world narrowed to the machine in front of him and the ground beneath it. Everything else faded to background noise. A round impacted close enough to knock him off balance. He caught himself on one knee, steadied, then rose again without looking back. Someone started toward him, intent on pulling him out of the open. Daniel shook his head once, sharply, and waved them back. Not yet. The tank cleared the worst of the obstruction and rolled onto firmer ground. Daniel raised both hands, signaling the crew to hold. He listened again, head tilted, eyes closed for a brief second. It was not fully operational. He knew that. The engine tone was wrong. The alignment was imperfect. But it would move. It would clear the route. It would not leave the crew sitting in the open. Daniel stepped back at last, moving out of the direct line behind the tank. The vehicle idled, rough, but alive. Around them, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The shouting had stopped. The radios quieted slightly. People watched the tank and then looked at Daniel with expressions that had changed from doubt to something closer to respect. No one clapped. No one cheered. It did not feel like that kind of moment. It felt heavier, more sobering. Daniel wiped his hands again, slower this time. He checked his gloves, adjusted his helmet, and looked once more at the tank, making sure it would hold for what came next. He said nothing about what he had just done. He did not explain the risk he had taken or the experience that had guided his choices. He simply stepped aside, giving the crew room to move. The route was open, at least for now. And for the first time since the chaos had begun, no one suggested abandoning the vehicle. The sound of approaching vehicles cut through the settling noise, heavier and more deliberate than the hurried movement around the tank. A pair of armored escorts rolled in from the far end of the route, followed by a command vehicle marked with fresh dust and the unmistakable presence of authority. Conversations faltered as heads turned. A senior officer stepped down, his uniform marked by long days in the field rather than ceremony. He took in the scene with a single sweep of his eyes. The damaged tank. The crew standing by. The cleared route that should not have been cleared at all. He walked toward the vehicle, boots crunching over gravel, and stopped short when he noticed Daniel. The change in him was immediate and unmistakable. His stride slowed. His shoulders squared. Whatever question he had been about to ask never left his mouth. He studied Daniel's face for a moment, then nodded once, as if confirming something he had half expected to find. "Mercer," he said, not loudly but with certainty. "Didn't think I'd see you here." Daniel straightened slightly, turning to face him. He did not salute right away. He waited for the cue, as if this were not about formality but about acknowledgement. The officer's voice lowered, losing its edge. He addressed Daniel by full rank, then added a designation that drew quiet attention from everyone within earshot. It was not Daniel's current role. It was what he had been before, a former armor crew chief. A battlefield recovery specialist, a man who had pulled vehicles and people out of worse situations than this one. No one needed the details spelled out. The words alone shifted the air. The officer glanced at the tank, then back at Daniel. "I heard what you did," he said simply. There was no praise in his tone, only recognition. Figures. Daniel gave a small nod, nothing more. He did not explain the repair or the risk. He did not mention the fire or the timing. He accepted the acknowledgement the way he accepted everything else, quietly. Around them, soldiers stood frozen in place. Some looked at Daniel with new understanding. Others looked away, absorbing the realization that they had misjudged him. The earlier laughter felt distant now, almost unreal. The officer turned slightly, addressing the gathered personnel without raising his voice. He said the route would hold. He said the tank would move when needed. He said good work and meant it. Then he looked back at Daniel one last time. "Good to have you here," he said. Daniel nodded again. That was all. As the officer moved on and the convoy resumed its careful flow, the silence lingered. It was not awkward. It was respectful. The kind that followed the recognition of something solid and unshowy. Daniel stepped back toward his tools, blending once more into the background. But the space around him had changed. He was no longer invisible. He had not needed to explain who he was. They could see it now. The tank moved first, slow and deliberate, its engine still rough but steady enough to trust. Tracks bit into the dirt and gravel, pushing forward along the route Daniel had cleared inch by inch. Dust rose behind it in a low curtain, not dramatic, just real, the kind that followed work done under pressure. As it rolled past the point where it had nearly been abandoned, the crew inside stayed alert, hands steady on controls, eyes forward. They were alive because the vehicle moved. That fact did not need to be spoken aloud. It hung in the air, understood by everyone watching. The supply vehicles behind it began to follow one by one, keeping distance, easing through the choke point that had moments earlier felt like a death trap. Radios crackled with updates, the tension in the voices easing just enough to signal relief without celebration. Daniel stood off to the side of the route, tools secured, helmet still on. He watched the tank carefully as it passed, listening to the engine note, tracking the way the suspension handled the uneven ground. Only when it cleared the bend did he let his shoulders drop a fraction. A few soldiers who had laughed earlier now stood with hands resting awkwardly on their gear. No one spoke. No one joked. Their eyes followed the tank, then drifted back to Daniel, lingering there longer than before. One of them started to say something, then stopped. The words did not feel necessary anymore. The crew commander climbed partially out of the hatch as the tank slowed briefly, raising a fist in a simple signal of acknowledgement. It was not flashy. It was not for an audience. It was meant for one man standing in the dust beside the road. Daniel met the gesture with a small nod. Nothing more. As the tank moved on, the sound of its engine faded into the distance, replaced by the steady flow of the convoy and the low murmur of controlled movement. The danger had not vanished, but it had shifted. The immediate crisis was over. A soldier stepped closer to Daniel, then stopped, unsure of protocol. He straightened and gave a quick salute, sharp and respectful. It was not ordered. It was instinct. Another followed, then another, each one brief, understated, sincere. No one announced it. No one drew attention to it. It happened quietly, spreading through the group like an unspoken agreement. Daniel acknowledged each salute the same way, with a nod of his head, his expression unchanged. He did not return them formally. He did not need to. The exchange was about recognition, not rank. There were no smiles. No clapping. No words of praise passed around. That kind of noise would have felt wrong here. Instead, there was a shared stillness, a collective pause in which everyone seemed to absorb what had just happened. The mockery from earlier felt distant now, almost embarrassing in hindsight. Not because anyone had been shamed, but because they had been reminded how easy it was to overlook quiet competence. An officer nearby watched the interaction without intervening. He did not break the moment. He simply nodded once, to himself, and turned back to his duties. Daniel checked his watch, then bent to pick up a wrench he had set down earlier. He wiped it clean, inspected it, and returned it to its place with the same care he had shown at the beginning of the chaos. The work, for him, was never really over. The base settled into a new rhythm. The immediate danger had passed, replaced by vigilance and routine. Soldiers returned to their positions. Radios resumed their steady cadence. Life continued, shaped by the narrow margin that had just been preserved. Daniel slung his tool bag over his shoulder and took a step away from the route. No one stopped him. No one asked for explanations or stories. The respect he had earned did not demand anything further from him. As he walked back toward the maintenance area, a few heads turned to follow his progress. Not with curiosity now, but with understanding. He did not look back. The silence that followed him was not empty. It was full of recognition, of shared awareness, of the kind of respect that did not need to be spoken to, be real. The tank was gone, the route was clear, and the men were alive. That was enough. By the time dusk settled over the base, the air had changed. The sharp edge of urgency had dulled into something steadier, replaced by routine sounds and low voices. The sky darkened slowly, smoke thinning as generators hummed and lights flickered on one by one. Daniel Mercer was back where he had started, kneeling beside a workbench under a strip of harsh white light. His helmet rested nearby, his gloves off now as he wiped grime from a set of tools with a rag he had folded the same way 100 times before. His movements were unhurried, precise, as if nothing out of the ordinary had happened at all. A few soldiers passed by and slowed without meaning to. They watched him for a moment longer than necessary, not out of curiosity, but out of respect that had not been there before. Daniel did not notice, or if he did, he gave no sign of it. Someone offered a quiet word of thanks as they walked past. Daniel answered with a nod, eyes still on the tool in his hands. He did not look up. He did not invite conversation. The tank crew came through later, tired and subdued, their vehicle parked safely beyond the wire. One of them paused near Daniel, opened his mouth as if to say something more, then thought better of it. He settled for a brief look of acknowledgement before moving on. Daniel finished cleaning his tools and stowed them carefully, each piece returning to its place. He checked a maintenance log, made a small note, and closed it. The work continued, as it always did. War had a way of spotlighting certain roles while leaving others in shadow. Pilots, infantry, those whose actions were loud and visible, often carried the stories forward. But behind every movement, every mission that reached its end, there were people like Daniel, steady hands in the background, making sure the machines held long enough for others to survive. He had never asked for recognition. He had never needed it. His measure of success had always been simpler than that. If the vehicle moved when it needed to. If the crew came back alive. If the problem was solved. As night fully claimed the base and the stars emerged faintly overhead, Daniel slung his bag over his shoulder and headed toward the maintenance bay. The sounds of distant fire were gone now, replaced by the familiar rhythm of a place settling into watchful rest. The day would not be remembered for him. There would be no report that captured what he had done in full. But the men who lived through it would remember, even if they never spoke of it again. Courage is not always the one pulling the trigger. Sometimes it is the one keeping the machine alive. Stories like Daniel Mercer's rarely make headlines. They unfold in the background, in the spaces between orders and outcomes, carried by people who never expect to be noticed. Quiet professionals, steady under pressure, whose work keeps others moving forward when everything else is breaking down. Across the world, in every generation, there are men and women like him. Mechanics, medics, engineers, technicians. Veterans whose courage shows itself not in speeches or medals, but in discipline, patience, and the willingness to stand where they are needed most, even when no one is watching. If you know someone like that, or if you are one of them, this story is for you. Their service matters. Their silence does not make their sacrifice smaller. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These stories keep the courage alive for generations to come.